If my Italian colleague,
Sorry, I will skip some more slides.
yes, joins us up here. My name is Dimitris Keridis, and I'm a professor of international relations at Pandion University in Athens, Greece, and the director of one of the partners in this migration project, Navarino Network, which is a public policy think tank up north in Thessaloniki. And I am particularly delighted to be with you this morning, and in general to be in Budapest the last 2 days. We have been treated extraordinarily warmly, and one of the purposes of the visit is to establish friendship, cooperation networks, and I think as far as that side is concerned, we are on a very, very strong ground. So I really would like to thank our hosts and organizers of this morning from the Central European University, and I look forward to reciprocating in the south, in Greece, soon enough. I think we are dealing with a very important matter, the question starting with the refugee crisis, but more broadly with migration, which is, as you know, is a global challenge. A, because of globalization, and I want to go further into that. And second, because, and this is the underlying story of our panels, the Arab world is imploding in front. This is one of the policy areas that are infested by nonsense. There is a lot of nonsense in the public realm, and actually we live in a time, 2016 and 2017 probably, will remember as, you know, the crescendo of nonsense in public life and politics. I don't want to mention examples. We just get a referendum after all, and we bow to the will of the sovereign Italian people, who in their intimate wisdom rejected Renzi yesterday. But migration in general is more prone to nonsense than other fields. And everybody seems to have an opinion, and everybody seems to have a very strong argument, and to be more of an activist rather than an analyst. And I would say that what we need the most is serious, hard analysis of the facts. Simply saying that migration is good or migration is bad wouldn't do the trick. And for example, as we mentioned in the previous panel, thanks to Pavlos, economic consequences are of different kinds and impact, no matter how much some of us would like to think that our aging European societies need as much migration as possible. There are some countries that can manage to attract high-skilled migration, like America, and Europe has failed in that regard. There are issues of inequality, etc., inside the hosting societies, etc. So this is a policy area, a glorious policy area, where young analysts have a virgin territory to prove their worth and to try to influence the public debate, because really what we need, if we are not to be sidelined by provocateurs and demagogues, especially on the extreme right, we need the facts. And because of that, we have two people in our panel to help us out this morning. A Serb from Austria and an Italian from Britain, and me, a Greek in Hungary. It tells you a lot about today's Europe. So we are par excellence the Europe of today, to speak about the destination countries. The previous panel was about the transit, the destination countries. We've lost our German, who was a German from Germany. But I think, you know, Germany is always well represented. No matter what, it's the one country we cannot avoid talking about these days. So we will come back to Germany. Let me start with Marko Kmezic, who is a lecturer and senior researcher at the University of Graz, where, as you know, they have established with Florian Bieber and his colleagues a wonderful center of excellence in Southeast European studies, Graz in Austria. Marko, you have the floor. 15 minutes is okay?
Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Also, my thanks for the organizers for the wonderful hospitality. And at the time that I was contemplating the possible title for the presentation, I came up with the following on Jonas question marks. I came up with something called "From Refugees Welcome to Refugees Don't Even Think About It," and that has roughly been the outline of the events happening in Austria with regard to the refugee crisis over the past 2.5, 3 years. Refugees Welcome was the first official policy of the Austrian government as well, at the beginning of the looming unprecedented refugee crisis, the biggest since the Second World War, as we are all familiar with. And soon after, it has changed, and it is important to tackle the reasons of why the response of the government, but also of a larger part of the society, has changed ever since the beginning of the offset of the crisis. Well, quite honestly, the answer lies within the internal political contestation in Austria, whereby the dissonant and inconsistent policy of the Grand Coalition government composed of Social Democrats and European People, not European, but People's Party, was unable to provide, as the same as the European answer was not coherent, was unable to provide really good answer to the unprecedented crisis as it was. And soon after, this has given some new wind into the wings of the far-right FPÖ, who started taking over land by land in Austria in local elections back in late 2014 and throughout 2015. And of course, migration and refugee issues have featured prominently in the recent presidential elections that have not only lasted over the past weekend, but have spanned throughout the past year in Austria due to circumstances that we are all familiar with. And my point here is that much of this debate was shaped on the something that we can define as post-factual society in which we live in today, not just Austria, but the wider world, with the uprise of these populist, xenophobic, and often nationalist leaders from California to Ankara to Moscow. And in fact, this post-factual society and post-factual culture is something in which debate is framed largely by appeals to emotions, often disconnected from the details of policy, and repeated assertion of talking points to which facts are ignored. And hereby, I have just listed a couple of titles from the local journals for the local media, in fact not from the local media, but from the internet, that deal with the consequences of the refugee crisis in Austria. So here is one. In Austria, over half of all asylum seekers commit crimes. Quite a strong title, right? Difficult to verify. More women raped by asylum seekers in Austria. 11,000 asylum seekers broke the law in Austria in the first part of 2016. I would ask you to guess the source of these news, and perhaps some of you would ring a light and guess it. It's actually Russia Today. And this is also important to see how these third parties are influencing the local debates, because much of these titles have, without any fact-checking and verification of details, have been translated and transferred not only in local Austrian media, but also in media in the UK and elsewhere. So it is easy then to understand this wind in the back of these far-right political parties and the rise of the FPÖ in Austria as we have it today. Now, the answer of the Austrian government at first relied on following up on the policies of the EU and aligning with the EU policies, which have in fact led to the end of the Balkan route in 2015, and also this EU plan on refugee quotas, which, although accepted by the Austrian government, was immediately criticized as being totally unrealistic by the Minister of Foreign Relations and European Affairs of the Austrian government. In the meantime, in 2015, Austria has seen 90,000 new asylum applicants in 2015, as I said, which is second biggest number of first-time asylum seekers in Europe, but in terms of per capita, due to relative small size of the country, it is the first. Austria ranks number 1 in terms of new asylum applications in 2015. Also, this is threefold increase over the, in comparison to the year 2014. And now, due to the internal contestations and upcoming, at that time, presidential elections, and also still pending parliamentary elections due in 2017, Austrian official policy was to follow up on European policies, but also to pursue its own way. And this is something that I'm going to talk about in the rest of my today's speech. And basically, I will inform you about 2 parallel tracks through which I see that Austrian policy has tackled this issue. The first is something of a self-isolationism in terms of making it much more difficult, legally difficult, for asylum seekers to apply in Austria. And secondly, it's somewhat of a coalition of willing, actually I don't want to use that term, that refers to something else, but building up a new coalition within the Europe, and this is the coalition of Visegrad countries and also Western Balkan 6 countries. So these 2 parallel tracks is something that I'm going to talk to in more detail. Now, the first thing that Austrian government did is to propose a daily cap of 80 asylum applicants at its borders to be addressed in the upcoming period. This amounts to 37,500 in a year, so 3 times less than Austria has seen in 2015. And this is, of course, because official Vienna did not believe that refugee Balkan route was effectively closed, and they believed that refugees would definitely find a new path into Central Europe, be it through the smuggler routes or whatever else. So the National Council of the Austrian Parliament has adopted a new law which allows the federal government to declare a state of emergency and drastically, in fact, curtail the right to seek asylum in Austria. Now, this has been immediately adopted as the legal wall to asylum, and it has been described by the local NGOs same as a razor wire fence, towards which Austrian society was very much against and was shocked when the first fences were set up throughout Hungary. And in fact, these special measures for the maintenance of public order and the safeguarding of internal security, as they are called, in the event of significant arrival of migrant and asylum seekers, were adopted without going into much detail about basically clarifying what is this significant arrival of migrants and asylum seekers, and the law has failed to define exactly what could trigger and justify the impositions of these special measures. However, the key thing and the key feature of this new law is the fast-track admissibility procedure for asylum seekers at the Austrian land borders. Now, effectively, the new law would lead to the return of individuals to the country from which they came from. And the only ones to allow to go into Austria to apply for asylum would be those who can declare and prove immediately the land border crossing, that either their life is in danger or that they would be tortured if they're not granted asylum. Or secondly, if their family nucleus is already in Austria and they would be allowed to join them. So, in fact, this procedure is grounded in the Dublin Dublin regulation, and it is grounded in the flawed premise that all the countries share common asylum standards and procedures, but in fact it seeks to bypass the minimal procedural guarantees that must accompany the return to the first country, to the first EU country of origin. So what this in fact means is that the appeal procedure is possible only after the return has already taken place, and also it blocks access to fair and efficient procedure and denies the right of effective remedy. The borders have been effectively set up on Austrian frontiers since April 2016, so from April this year, and immediately the asylum applicants have dropped by 55% in Austria. At the same time, on the EU level, asylum applicants have dropped by 33%, so this is slightly lower than the EU average. And the next step, which is still being negotiated and debated, is the reduction of economic benefits for refugees, which in turn would strongly impede the possibility to integrate incoming refugees in the Austrian society. So that has been the one tier of the approach, and the second one refers to the stronger presence of the Austrian foreign policy and alignment with the initiatives coming from Visegrad countries, and to a certain extent misuse of the ongoing enlargement policy in the Western Balkans. And this follows a February initiative undertaken by Minister Kurz, who has visited and toured Western Balkans, focusing on the refugee crisis. And the main task of his touring the Western Balkans was in fact to protect external borders, but we cannot debate external borders of the EU because at this time Greece was totally circumvented and kept out of these negotiations. So in fact he was trying to secure the external borders of Central Europe by breaking some shady deals with the Western Balkan countries. And this was followed up by a meeting held in Vienna in February 24, to which again representatives of Greece foreign ministry were not invited, and this triggered sort of a bilateral diplomatic mini war between the two countries, whereby Greece has even recalled the ambassador from Vienna. Now, what do I mean by these shady deals between the two countries, and how do I see this exercise undermining the efforts of democratization, which is undertaken within the process of stabilization and association process, or through the process of enlargement? Now, clearly, and I hope that Zoran will not mind, I will take Macedonia as a case study and provide some of the examples for my claim. Now, whereby the latest progress report on Macedonia, published just a month ago, reads that political and democratic situation is deteriorating in country due to the state capture affecting functioning of democratic institutions and key areas of society. We have just heard Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austria speaking at the election campaign event in Macedonia a few days ago, backing up, in fact, the government of Macedonia, claiming something completely the opposite than the EU progress report. So he was actually praising Macedonia's democracy on its path towards the European Union, blatantly actually undermining the transformative power of Europe, if such thing exists still these days. But nonetheless, the question is why he did that. And the answer, which is no longer such a secret, it is already known in Austria as well, is that exactly in these February meetings, the deal that has been brokered whereby Macedonia and the countries of the Western Balkans would seal their borders a bit more and prevent the influx of refugees and spillover to the Central Europe, most notably Austria and Germany, whereby in return Austrian not only Minister of Foreign Affairs, but in fact European People Party representatives from Austria would support Vomero in their campaign and their bid to retain the power in Macedonia. So you see, what I'm trying to say is that Austria did not, in fact, align itself fully with EU policies, both in terms of fight against the, or in fact, common policy towards the migration crisis, towards the refugee crisis, but also when it comes to enlargement to the Western Balkans, so future European strategy towards the enlargement. And in this regard, we might see that the internal contestation within Austria and the rise of these populism and xenophobia and nationalism has caused Austrian policy to become much more self-concerned and shape the European debate in areas that have not been predicted and have not been maybe so visible in the years prior to the crisis of the refugees.
Thank you, well on time. So, quiz is good. Now, our next and final speaker, Francesca Strumia from Torino, and now a lecturer in law at the University of Sheffield, one more Italian, one more economic migrant from Italy to Britain. My question before you start, Francesca, how much the migration crisis in Italy, which we know is severe, affected the results of the referendum? I know that your region, Piedmont, did not vote yes, only Tuscany and Emilia-Romagna, as I could check this morning, said yes.
Milan voted yes. Lombardia. So.
I don't think so. Are you serious? Yeah? Lombardy?
Well,
Yeah. Okay. And then Lombardy, but not Torino, and not Piedmont. So, did it affect the referendum? Or it
I
didn't?
can only give you an impressionistic answer. I believe to some extent it did, in the sense that it captured a sense of overall discontent with what is going on in the country, and arrivals of refugees have picked up in the last few months. I don't know if there's a clear correlation. The referendum question was very complex. It was not even a vote against Renzi. It was, after all, it is a constitutional reform. It had been approved.
Speak up, please.
Yes.
Very much.
It was a constitutional reform. So the referendum vote was on a reform already approved by Parliament, but under the Italian constitution, if you don't reach a qualified majority,
You have to go to referendum.
a referendum can be requested, and it was requested in this case. So the technical question was on the constitutional reform. And the no camp joins a number of different point of views. So there's certainly a slice of that which is dissatisfaction with the current status of things, and you can put the migrant crisis in there, I believe. So, again, that's an impressionistic response. I don't have correlation data or anything like that. Okay, so instead I'm going to switch to the UK now, and I'm also somewhat lonely from a disciplinary perspective in this group because I'm a lawyer. So Dimitris,
Nobody's perfect.
you asked me for hard facts, and I'm afraid I'm going to give you some hard rules here, because that's what we lawyers really like. And what I'm going to talk about is the UK role in the EU legal response to the migrant crisis. And in order to do this, I'll give a brief overview of what are the EU rules that have been adopted to manage the asylum system, but in particular also the, let's call it the migrant crisis. And then I will talk a bit more about the role of the UK in this context. And the argument I want to make is that the UK is characterized by a position of exceptionalism in the context of the migrant crisis for a number of reasons. First of all, a geographical reason, so it is somewhat removed from the immediate impact of the crisis, but also from a legal perspective. And then, of course, because of its current relationship, evolving relationship with the European Union, let's say, Today is also the first day of the hearing in the Supreme Court on the Brexit litigation, which is on the first page of all UK newspapers this day. Okay, so let me give you a bit of an overview of the EU legal response to the migrant crisis then, and we have touched upon some of these points this morning, but I'll try to make a little revision of things that probably many of you are already familiar with. So the EU has a common immigration policy. It has a competence in this sense under the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. As part of the common immigration policy, it has developed over the years a common European asylum system. And the idea of this common asylum system is to develop a structure for a coordinated application of the Geneva Convention on the Rights of Refugees, the 1951 Geneva Convention, among the member states. So the EU legal instrument in the field cover the 4 questions on the slide. So who qualifies for international protection in a member state of the European Union? What are the procedures to review the applications for asylum in the member states? What are the reception conditions for asylum seekers pending review of their applications? And most importantly, the famous or infamous Dublin regulation. The current regulation is number 3, which is the instrument that sets the rule according to which the member state responsible to review an application for asylum is in principle the first member state of entry, with a number of corrective rules such as family reunification. This is the background legal frame. What has been the EU legal response to the migrant crisis? And here we can distinguish contingent response and, let's say, medium to long-term response. Contingent response has gone along 3 tracks, I would say. One is relocation. We have referred to this in the debate earlier this morning, 2 decisions in September 2015, whereby the member states of the European Union in the Council pledged to relocate a total of 160,000 asylum seekers from Italy and Greece to other member states. As at the 9th of November, according to the Commission data, the number of effective relocations is 6,925, so certainly not a very effective response. Second resettlement, July 2015, informal decision of the Council. These times the member states are pledging to resettle vulnerable third country nationals from the countries of origin to the European Union, so before they get to the European Union, up to a number of 22,000 and something. As at the 9th of November, the number resettled was about 11,000. And finally, the EU-Turkey agreement, and I will not go into the details of these. I will only say that as part of the one-to-one return and resettlement mechanism, according to Commission data, again, as at the beginning of November, about 2,200 people had been resettled, and these are part of those 11,000 in the resettlement scheme. So the resettlement scheme has been used to implement the EU-Turkey agreement. Contingent legal response. At the same time, because the migrant crisis has represented such a test on the legal framework of the European Union, the Commission has tabled a number of proposals for reform of the legal frame between May and July 2016. So at this stage, we're only talking about proposals, 7 measures. The most important, or let's say most influential of these are a reform of the Dublin regulation, whereby the mechanism according to which the first member state of entry is the member state responsible to review an asylum application would be supplemented with a corrective mechanism. So where there is a disproportionate influx of asylum seekers in certain member states, as has been the case in these last few years, a corrective mechanism will be triggered and a redistribution of the relevant applications. And second, a proposal for a regulation setting a common system of resettlement from third countries into the European Union. And I come to the promised role of the UK in all of this. And here perhaps you'll begin to see the exceptionalism, because the UK, even before the whole Brexit referendum and the disintegration from the European Union, did not participate in the EU common immigration policy because it has an opt-out from the relevant part of the treaties, under one of the protocols of the treaties. And this means basically the UK has a pick and choose approach. So it can choose to participate and be bound by relevant EU policies and regulations, or it can choose to stay out. How did this work in terms of the common European asylum system? In a first phase of the adoption of the common European asylum system, the UK did participate in relevant policy and legislation. In the second phase, which is the current one, measures adopted between 2011 and 2013, the UK has opted out of relevant legislation except for the Dublin regulation. The UK does participate in the Dublin system. I'll say in a few moments how this affects the role of the UK in all of this. How has it participated in the contingent response of the EU to the migrant crisis? No participation in the relocation plan, the 160,000. The UK did not opt in, so it's not involved in that mechanism at all. On the other hand, it did participate in the decision on resettlements. And according to the Commission, it's also the only country that has implemented the 2,200 places that it has pledged under the decision. In addition, the UK government has also strengthened a pre-existing unilateral scheme for the resettlement of vulnerable persons from Syria, and under that scheme it has resettled about 4,000 people up to the 1st December of this year. And the third point is Dublin transfers. So the UK does participate in the Dublin regulation, and it has requested in the course of 2015 a number of Dublin transfers back to continental countries, mostly France, Ireland and Italy. It has requested 2,000 transfers, so on the ground that relevant asylum seekers had already entered one of the other EU countries before reaching the UK, and has implemented about 500 of these. So, to put this data in a bit of a broader context, there is a heightened discourse on migration in the UK these days. The discourse focuses mostly on EU migrants in the context of the Brexit negotiations, and the UK government just released on the 1st of December the most recent data on net migration to the UK, which is at a record high in the last few years. 335,000 people, of which 189,000 are EU migrants. Why am I saying this? Because the refugee phenomenon to some extent tends to disappear in this mainstream discourse of like the massive influx of EU migrants. In the year ending September 2016, there were 41,000 asylum applications in the UK, about 33% of which were granted relief at initial decision. And the most popular nationalities among asylum applicants are the ones you see on the slide. So this is again a viewpoint on the exceptionalism of the UK, this time perhaps from a geographical perspective. If we compare the nationalities of origin of the asylum applicants in the UK with the nationalities of migrants entering Europe via sea, this is UNHCR data on entries via sea in the course of 2016, but also along the other corridors that were discussed today, there is a mismatch there, right? So the idea is that actually most of the applicants for asylum in the UK come from other routes and are potentially migrants who first enter as tourists or on another ground and then who remained and applied for asylum. So another viewpoint on the exceptionalism of the UK. So, given this particular position of the country in the legal framework, in the political discourse, what are the issues and challenges going forward that perhaps also define the role of the UK in our research project over the next few years? Well, it's Brexit all over, I guess. So the UK is in the course of disintegration from the European Union, or is going to be in the course of disintegration soon. So the moment it leaves the European Union, of course, the legal frame, common immigration policy will not apply at all. And this provides an interesting test, because the UK to some extent has benefited from its pick and choose approach to the EU common policy. It has been able to send back those few refugees that it receives from the continent through the Dublin transfers. How will this change in a post-Brexit scenario? And second, there's a question of discourse. So the migrants discourse has been very much at the heart of the Brexit debate, but again, not so much focusing on the migrant crisis, even if it has been exploited in some of the media campaigns, but the focus has been mostly on EU migrants. And so I think two interesting questions to see there is whether the resistance to migration in general feeds into resistance to refugees going forward, or if on the other hand, the sense of regaining control at the borders against the hordes of European migrants that invade the UK may create a more positive, permissive attitude towards refugees. And so perhaps to generalize the question, the UK may be an interesting sounding board for some of the arguments that we are exploring as part of this research project. One of the main research questions is whether more European integration can help provide a response to the migrant crisis. The one perspective that I am particularly interested in as a lawyer is whether the devising of a common policy and a common legal frame may help to some extent to ground a sense of common responsibility for the problem. It has failed clearly so far. Is there a way around that? And in this respect, the UK is an interesting sounding board. So testing what happens with this integration there. If this leads to further engagement in terms of management of migrant pressures from third countries, or to further disengagement. And this is one of the questions to explore going forward. But so just to conclude, I started by saying the UK is in an exceptional position, and therefore perhaps in a rapidly changing scenario, paradoxically its position is not changing much.
Fascinating and very interesting, and this is what I meant about facts. And legal facts are also important, not only sociological and economic, but legal. Two questions, observations, one to each before we open up the discussion, and we have time for a good discussion. Francesca, the UK example is even more erratic and interesting in a way, because the UK was the one country that did not impose a transition period in the free movement of labour when East Europeans joined in EU in 2004. Contrary to what happened in France, Germany and the rest of the continent, the UK had a very kind of generous, open-minded policy vis-à-vis the Polish plumber. 12 years later, we see they go the other extreme. And I wonder how much did this one extreme help to go to the other extreme, if it was a mistake of, the liberal elites in London back then to allow all this migration, the fact that millions chose England rather than other destinations, and how does this fit in the current debate. The second observation question to Marko, post-factual world refers to both sides, I'm afraid. We tend to focus obviously to the post-facts of the extremists on the right vis-à-vis migration, but we have our own work to do. So to provoke you, because you gave us a lot of criminality statistics, it is true that migrants are overrepresented in prison population all over Europe. In Greece, for example, foreign-born residents make 10% of the population, but of the general population, but almost 40% of the prison population. So it's like 4 times higher. And I'm sure the similar statistics can be found here and there. So what does this, that doesn't mean that migrants are criminals, of course, but it does mean that there are facts and statistics we should not sweep away in this general tendency we have, especially in academia, to be nice people. And I want to challenge you on that front. So you keep that in mind, and we open up now to the general discussion and audience. Yes, please. Identify yourself first.
Nick Thorpe from the BBC. Question, we have migrants or refugees from Afghanistan haven't been much mentioned this morning, and yet they are, as far as I know, the single largest number of people still coming through the Balkans. In the Austrian, Greek, or British context, is there any agreement in the authorities handling applications from Afghan citizens of who should be granted asylum or not? So sort of factually, I would just give one example from Bulgaria, where the Interior Ministry told me that only Afghans from 2 particular provinces were being granted protection or asylum there, and yet the situation in Afghanistan is clearly deteriorating, and there seems to be no. Is that also your experience in the countries?
Good. Yes, Dimitri.
Thank you.
From the previous panel.
From the previous panel. A question for Marko on Austrian politics. You emphasized a lot in your presentation the domestic political constellation and how this plays out with the migration issue. And my question to you is whether you think that the presidential election that was decided yesterday was in essence affected by this crisis, and the extent to which one could identify, if you like, a silver lining in the fact that a country that proved to be so polarized and so deeply split between the 2 candidates chose the independent, green candidate over the far right one. And the reason I ask, and perhaps you also want to draw on this too, is that it appears within all the sort of doom and gloom that 2016 seems to have brought up, it appears that at least the presidential election result in Austria seems to be suggesting that the European Union and European Union membership, following Brexit and following the Trump victory in the United States, can still be used and mobilized by politicians to actually win elections rather than lose them. Because it seems that the far-right candidate was accused, either implicitly or explicitly, for wishing to have an exit, so an Austrian exit from the EU. So if you would like to sort of elaborate a little bit on these, I would be very pleased to listen to your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we had enough, 3 to start, and then we have the second round, okay? Yeah. Please. You start, Francesca.
Should I start?
Yeah. Ladies first, please.
Okay, so Dimitris, on the question of the 2004 opening, let's say, of the borders to the new countries in the UK, interestingly, it's quite a forgotten detail in the Brexit debate. I think it rarely comes up. I don't have the element to judge whether it was a mistake. I would say that the resistance to the EU migrants is more part of a political trend, also a sense of looking for a cause for certain national diseases, and something that comes back also in British history. For instance, if you look at the evolution of legislation on the migration of Commonwealth nationals in the 20th century, there is a similar trend. Very liberal policy under the 1948 nationality, and then a switch, because many migrants are coming from the Commonwealth countries, and then from the 1960s on, the immigration policies changes radically there. And I think it's a similar phenomenon here. So now the government is looking more towards an alliance to the Commonwealth countries again, but it's sort of a back and forth. So, and also the opening of the borders in 2004, for sure it has brought about a quite visible impact, particularly in some local communities. So it's true that in London perhaps you don't see the effect, but there are some cities, some municipalities around the UK that have been affected more by the influx of migrants. Even if those economic data that were presented this morning hold also in respect of EU migrants in the UK. So the studies that have been conducted, for instance, by UCL, for instance, by the European Citizen Action Service, all indicate that the EU migrants are, in average, younger, contribute tax more than they take out in benefits, so they have overall a positive impact in labour market and economic terms. Of course, they raise resistances at the political level. The question on Afghanistan, I'm afraid I haven't studied Afghanistan refugees in the specifics, so I'm not able to give you a precise response. What I can say from a EU law perspective is that regardless of the particular position of the UK, as things stand, the list of safe countries of origin, the list of country conditions that qualify a person for refugee status is very much decided country by country. So it's certainly possible that there is a particular qualification of Afghanistan nationals in terms also of the regions of provenance within the country. As part of
does that change? Is it revised?
Yes, I think it is revised at regular intervals. It's very much a policy decision. What I can say is that the European Commission, as part of the new package of measures that I mentioned earlier, has also included a proposed common list of safe countries of origin. Now, of course, this probably wouldn't apply in the UK going forward.
Sure. Well, first, Dimitris, and comments on facts, post-facts, criminality statistics. I fully agree. Number of refugees do commit crimes, as well as number of refugees are eating, sleeping, falling in love. They're doing exactly the same thing as the locals do. Now, two things. I believe that this particular aspect of their life is being increasingly presented in the media, and this is what differs the situation from the same things done by the local society. And talking about statistics, I do see the potentially disparity between the number of refugees and number of crimes committed. I'm not aware of it. I did not investigate it and looked at it, but there is a plausible theory this might be true. And then again, we need to ask ourselves, or in fact the society has to ask itself, has it done enough to integrate these people and to actually positively prevent them from engaging into criminal activities and provide them with a chance for brand new start. Now this is just from the top of my head. As I said, I really did not investigate into these matters in much depth. With regard to presidential elections, again, Dimitris, yes, well, I see that refugee crisis did play a big role, but in fact, you're perfectly right to say that it has not only strengthened the far right, but also this newly independent or left-wing option. And what it did even more so, it has really displayed the weakness of the current establishment of the mainstream political parties. And their weakness has not been displayed only with regard to the refugee crisis, but many other crisis, including the economic crisis, the crisis of the institutions, etc., received high levels of corruption, whatever you want to call it. And this was just, maybe the last, how to say it, the last drop that really deteriorated the chances of the governing mainstream parties and their candidates' prospects at the presidential election. So I do see that the refugee crisis played a prominent role, but it was not the only thing that really fueled into the debate. And finally, with regard to the question, gentleman from the Embassy of Yemen, the border will not, in fact, deteriorate relations between the two countries or the two governments. What it will do, and I see a negative repercussion there, it will affect negatively on the people living in these border regions. So it will take away some of the freedoms and liberties that they enjoyed in the past. And I will give you just one example of a Austrian citizen who has his own, vineyards at a beautiful region of South Styria, and his vineyard actually spans between the two countries. It runs on both sides of the borders. And when the police came to set up a frontier, this fence on his property, he was astonished and he did not allow for that to happen. And I believe this exactly portrays the feeling of the local citizens living on both sides of the borders, whose freedoms and liberties are in fact put into question with this solution.
Yes, I brought, people who are living the border, their complaints.
Yeah. Thank you. Just a quick remark on the BBC, a friend of ours. Just to make it clear, and Francesca will support me in that, the asylum applications are individual, and they are supposed in principle to be examined on an individual basis. Now the numbers are staggering, and we tend to group, and we tend to say that people from Syria, in principle, are refugees. They are forcefully forced out of the country. But that doesn't mean that the process of interview and examining its application meticulously on the first and the second degree, as the law provides, should not be done on an individual basis. That means that a Turkish citizen, for example, who does not produce overall refugees, might need asylum protection. If he's a Kurdish, activist, or there are a number of cases even from safer countries and we should not fall into this trap that it's country-wise, it's person by person wise, no matter how difficult it is bureaucratically to go through the process. Just in principle, we should remember.
Or at least it should be.
I was just surprised when the Bulgarian Deputy Interior Minister told me that his country's immigration authorities were following the EU rules in only accepting applications from two particular provinces.
As asylum, to grant them asylum. Good. So, yes, Pablo.
Just a comment slash question. The comment is basically building up on Dr. Kmezic's point, Marko's point, and then Marko's point, and then the question is directed to you, Dimitri. You discussed about the issue of crime and the fact that a large part of the population in prisons is emanating from this pool of migrants. And since we're talking about facts, and since the bibliography identifies a connection between schooling and criminality and how these two are connected, my point is that as we speak, approximately 20% of the around 55,000 people, 20% of the children coming from this population of people in Greece are on average away from schooling for about 1.5 years, and also they go to a maximum of even 5 years since the war started, and they haven't received schooling for the last 5 years, some of them, even at the ages of 11, 12, 13, not just the very small children. Linking that to empirical studies that have identified a unidirectional causality between schooling and criminality, and the fact that less schooling is basically leading to higher levels of criminality. My point is that, and following what Marko said, that when you cannot provide these people with the necessary, let's say, tools, with the necessary processes for them to integrate to whatever countries we're talking about, it doesn't have to do just with Greece, it doesn't have to do just with the UK, it's about, I think, for all countries. If you cannot provide them this schooling, then in my view, and from what the literature is saying, it is only natural to create the potential for people that are, let's say, less privileged in different societies to not be able to live a proper life and then end up in criminal. So, and another final fact, apart from the statistics and the data, is that you're really, we are aware, and especially us in Thessaloniki and in Greece, and you're probably aware that people in Thessaloniki were opposite towards small children from Syria at the ages of 5, 6, 7 years old of getting schooling, and the parents didn't allow these children to get schooling on the basis of them not being vaccinated, when the Greek authorities certified that all these children were vaccinated. So my point is, since the connection is there, I think there is a justification on the point you've made in terms of whether it is logical to have prisons with these populations or not. Thank you.
I'll come to that. Thank you. Yes, please.
My name is Mariam Rahman. I'm from the Embassy of Pakistan. My question is a two-part question. Part number one, as we are talking on the discussion of the refugees from the Arab world or the Muslim world, prior to, say, the air campaigns in Libya, in Syria, and in Yemen, there were no refugees, even when there was quote-unquote turmoil in the Arab world, say the 2011 Arab Springs in Tunisia and Egypt. There were no Tunisian refugees, there was no influx of Egyptian refugees into the European continent, as it were, despite the same proximity and the same routes. The second part of the question is that, is there a conflict of understanding with I would say I would not point at the European Union, but the people who are manning the reception centers or the refugee centers, can they not distinguish between actual asylum seekers and between people who are just being trafficked or just in a human smuggling context? Because even prior to the refugee context, prior to the refugee influx or the refugee migration wave, there was, as you can say, a human smuggling network that was thriving, and Europe being one of the destination countries or even transit countries was a part of that. So to me, it seems that right now the whole system or the EU relocation scheme and all of these mechanisms, they cannot streamline the two separate requirements of identifying just human smuggling, exporting cheap labor and whatever, and actual asylum seekers. What are your comments on that?
I'm just a moderator.
It's to the panelists.
That has failed to moderate moderately. Yeah, but are there any other, because this is the final second round, and we will have to go to lunch soon. So, is there any other question or comment that should be aired? Now is the time. Okay. Would you care for the human trafficking and smuggling networks and how to separate?
Yeah, sure. It's a challenging question. I'm sure there is the problem is there because the flux of people arguably includes both asylum seekers and people who qualify for refugee status under the Geneva Convention and people who are migrating for economic reasons. Now this creates a number of complexities in terms of identifying who is migrating for what reasons, and I guess this goes back to the application of the rules on an individual basis, also on a sort of country-specific basis to some extent, because even if refugee applications are treated on an individual basis, of course there are databases about the status of country independent also by NGOs, and there are in part it is a legal problem, in part it is a factual problem. I mean, because the fluxes are so intense, there is a factual problem in managing arrivals, and from the life-saving aspect to the identification aspect to the distinction of legitimate asylum claims from other migrants' claims. And it's a chain of steps, I would say, and of course it's an important question to identify exactly where are the most important weaknesses in there and difficulties.
Dimitri, can I jump in here?
Jump.
With a sub-question. So some governments, including the one in my country, are claiming that they're not, they don't have to accept economic migrants. What is your comment on that?
Okay, but they have to accept refugees. That's the juxtaposition. Dimitri.
Before you give an answer to your
Yes.
answer, just a comment to the colleague, because I may want to feed into what Francesca said. Yes, speaking to the UNHCR, which is located on the Greek islands, in some cases what happens is, theoretically, the moment they get there, they are meant to, if they wish to do so, start the application for asylum. The problem is, sometimes smugglers are within the camps on the islands. And what's happening is many people are being told consciously not to process the asylum application form because the smuggler has managed to convince them that there is a way out from the Greek islands all the way to some of their relatives, let's say in Germany or in Sweden or in Austria. And so I've been told of cases of people that actually came with the intention of applying and they were entitled to do so. And in terms of processing it, it may take a bit of a while, but the process begins, and yet people are stopped from doing so by smugglers who amazingly are inside the camps.
Yes.
So I guess the point I'm trying to raise, if it's of any value to our discussion, is that sometimes there are procedures set and they're meant to be followed, but the reality on the ground can be so chaotic, particularly when there was a large movement of people, that you can't really identify exactly who is on the camps. And in case you find smugglers who have ways out, who can get money from people that are still well off enough to escape from that area and move to Northern Europe, it becomes even more troublesome.
There is a class element to that, for sure. Richer people can find smuggling networks and circumvent walls where the poorer people are left behind. So, to be proper Marxist, one can say that nothing is equal and fair in this business, unfortunately. Francesca, you want to have...
Yeah, if I can give a quick response to that, I'm going to give you a very legal response. In terms of international law, there is no obligation on a sovereign country to admit economic migrants. I mean, the right, let's call it like that, to manage borders and to decide on admission and exclusion of foreigners is one of the prime rights of country sovereignty. Admission of refugees who qualify as refugees under the 1951 Convention can be seen from one perspective as an exception to this. It does ground an obligation, legal obligation for participating states to admit migrants. Then we could talk for hours about moral obligations beyond the legal ones, but I'll stop with the legal response.
By conclusion, I would like to introduce one more dimension in this migration debate and migration theory. Because we keep on talking a lot about the pushing factors that lead to migration or the refugee forced migration flows. and we tend to forget, and we shouldn't, because in migration theory they feature very prominently, the pooling factor. One of the peculiarities of migration is the fact that the more migration, the more momentum for more migration. So, if you have enough Poles in England, more Poles will have an incentive, other things being equal, to come to England rather than elsewhere. So the bigger the diaspora, the bigger the pooling factor, and as a result, creating disequilibria, a dynamic and momentum, which if it's lost, then leads to this adverse policy switch that Britain is so famous and Francesca presented so eloquently about. So you have large Caribbean migration, you don't know what to do, they keep on coming. Whole of Jamaica is in danger of moving into London. You turn on the door, the same with Poland, the same with Syria. Now the theory tells us that the best way to decrease the pooling factor is through integration. Because the more you integrate, the less of a Polish community distinct from the local population in England will exist. So we need to work on the integration policies. Now, because I feel we need to provoke the discussion and not just try to be nice people. It is easy, Pavlos, for private school graduates, you and me, to speak about, because if you go to the expensive private schools, you have the luxury of being, how should I say, liberal about migrants, because you don't have to be next to them. One could argue, and the fascists do argue that. Who are you to tell us in the working class neighborhoods of Salonika and Athens and I don't know where, that we have to admit children of Syria when you go to your expensive, exclusive, private high schools where you pay 10,000 euros and you preach us on what is right and wrong. And because so it happens that both you and I have graduated from such a school, I just wanted just to, spice it up. So there is a very, very difficult debate. And we should not absolve from our responsibility to come up with sensitive and sensible policies that work rather than easy kind of aphorisms, not that you did or anybody here did, but in the public debate between good and bad, black and white, pro-immigration and nice people, and the ugly fascists on the right. Because if we fall in that trap, we will lose the debate, and we will end up with more Brexits, exits, and exits. And because we all believe that in the end we don't need that, and it's counterproductive, we have to work more on that. Now, on this happy note, I would like to thank you for your patience, especially with the moderator, and I guess we have to go to lunch, and we will reconvene in an hour to continue this discussion. Thank you very much.